The moment I stepped out of the car, I knew this wasn't going to be the joyous occasion Ethan and I had hoped for. His parents' sprawling Victorian mansion loomed before us, its manicured lawn a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside my chest. "Ready, love?" Ethan squeezed my hand, his boyish grin a beacon of hope. I nodded, forcing a smile. At 37, I was hardly the blushing bride his parents probably envisioned for their 29-year-old son. And now, with our unexpected news. The door swung open before we reached it. Cecilia, Ethan's mother, stood there, her lips pursed in a tight smile. "Well, don't you two look cozy," she said, her eyes lingering on our clasped hands. "Mom, Dad," Ethan beamed, pulling me closer. "We have some exciting news." George, Ethan's father, appeared behind Cecilia, his imposing figure filling the doorway. "Oh, do tell, son." Ethan's grip tightened. "Leah and I are engaged." The silence that followed was deafening. Cecilia's eyes widened, while George's narrowed suspiciously. "That's quite a surprise," Cecilia finally managed. I cleared my throat. "There's more," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're also expecting a baby." The shock on their faces morphed into something uglier. George's jaw clenched, his eyes boring into me. "Well, isn't that convenient?" he spat. "Tell me, Leah, how long have you been planning this little arrangement?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Dad, what are you implying?" "Oh, come now," Cecilia chimed in, her voice dripping with disdain. "A woman your age suddenly engaged and pregnant? It's clear what's going on here." I felt the blood drain from my face. This was worse than I'd imagined. As Ethan began to argue with his parents, I stood there, frozen, wondering how our happiest news had turned into this nightmare. The drive home was silent, the weight of Ethan's parents' accusations hanging heavy between us. As we pulled into our driveway, I couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down my face, hot and angry. Hey, Ethan said softly, pulling me into his arms. "Don't let them get to you. We're in this together, remember?" I nodded against his chest, but doubt had already taken root. "What if they're right, Ethan? What if I am too old for this?" He pulled back, his eyes fierce. "Don't you dare say that. You're going to be an amazing mother." Later that night, as Ethan slept, I found myself in front of the bathroom mirror, scrutinizing every line on my face. At 37, I was hardly ancient, but in that moment, I felt every one of my years weighing me down. The next morning, nausea hit me like a freight train. As I knelt on the cold tile floor, heaving, the reality of my situation crashed over me. This wasn't just about Ethan's parents' disapproval anymore. This was about a real, living being growing inside me. "Leah?" Ethan's worried voice came from the doorway. "Do you need me to call the doctor?" I shook my head, wiping my mouth. "No, it's just morning sickness. I'll be fine." But as the days wore on, it became clear that this pregnancy wasn't going to be easy. The constant fatigue, the mood swings, the worries about potential complications, they all took their toll. One evening, after a particularly rough day, I found Ethan on the phone, his voice hushed but angry. "No, Dad, I won't come to my senses. Leah is my future, and that's final." As he hung up, our eyes met. The strain was visible on his face, and I realized with a sinking heart that this was tearing him apart too. How long could we keep this up before something had to give? The constant ringing of Ethan's phone was driving me mad. Every time it buzzed, I tensed, knowing it was likely his parents trying to change his mind about us. "Ethan, please," I begged one evening. "Just turn it off for a while." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't, Leah. They're still my parents." Just then his phone rang again. Ethan's face hardened as he answered. "Dad, I've told you." I couldn't hear George's words, but Ethan's reaction said it all. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. "You want to do what?" Ethan's voice rose. "Investigate Leah? Are you out of your mind?" My heart dropped. They wanted to investigate me, like I was some kind of criminal? Ethan's next words were ice cold. "Listen carefully, Dad. If you so much as hire a private investigator to look into Leah's past, we're done. No more calls, no more family dinners, no more anything. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Goodbye, Dad." He hung up and turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Leah. I never thought they'd go this far." I reached for him, my own pain momentarily forgotten. "Oh, Ethan, I never meant to come between you and your family." He pulled me close, his embrace fierce. "You are my family now, you and our baby." As we stood there, holding each other, I felt a flutter in my belly. Our baby, moving for the first time. It should have been a moment of pure joy, but instead, it was tainted by the knowledge that this innocent life was already causing so much strife. I looked up at Ethan, tears in my eyes. What are we going to do? His jaw set in determination. We're going to fight, together. The familiar sight of my childhood home should have been comforting, but as Ethan and I pulled into the driveway, my stomach churned with anxiety. We hadn't told my parents about the pregnancy yet, or about the disaster with Ethan's family. Mom opened the door before we could knock, her smile faltering as she took in our expressions. "Oh, sweethearts, what's wrong?" Dad appeared behind her, his brow furrowed with concern. Come in, come in. You both look like you could use a stiff drink, or at least some tea." As we settled in the living room, the whole story came pouring out. Mom's face darkened with each word while Dad listened intently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "And now," I finished, my voice cracking, "we don't know what to do. Ethan's parents hate me, and this stress can't be good for the baby." Mom reached out, squeezing my hand. "Oh, honey, we're here for you, both of you." Dad, however, had gone very still. He stood up abruptly and walked to the mantelpiece, picking up an old photo album. "Ethan," he said slowly, "what did you say your father's name was again?" "George," Ethan replied, confusion evident in his voice. "George Hartley. Why?" Dad's face paled as he flipped through the album. Finally, he turned it towards us, pointing to a faded photograph. "Is this him?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes widening. "Yes, that's my dad, but he looks so young. How do you have this?" Dad sank back into his chair, looking suddenly older. "Because, Ethan, I was your father's high school teacher, and let me tell you, George Hartley was one of the most troubled students I ever had." The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. I looked from Dad to Ethan, my mind reeling. This connection, it changed everything. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what aren't you telling us about George?" My heart pounded as we approached Ethan's parents' house once again. This time my father Richard walked beside us, his presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. The weight of his history with George hung heavy in the air. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" I whispered. He squeezed my hand. "It's time to face the past, sweetheart." Ethan rang the doorbell, his jaw set with determination. Cecilia answered, her eyes widening at the sight of us. "What's the meaning of this?" "We need to talk," Ethan said firmly. "All of us." George appeared behind her, his face darkening as he recognized my father. "Richard, what the hell are you doing here?" "Hello, George," Dad said calmly. "It's been a long time." The tension in the room was palpable as we all sat down. Dad took a deep breath and began to speak, recount George's troubled past as his student. I watched George's face contort with a mix of anger and shame. "You have no right to bring this up now," George snarled. "I have every right," Dad replied. "Your treatment of Leah and Ethan is unacceptable. You, of all people, should understand the importance of second chances." George's face flushed red. "Get out of my house!" "Not until you apologize to Leah," Ethan interjected, his voice steady. The room fell silent. I could see the internal struggle playing out on George's face. Finally, he turned to me, his words coming out through gritted teeth. I apologize for my behavior, Leah." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As we stood to leave, I caught a glimpse of George's eyes. They were filled with a cold, calculated fury that sent chills down my spine. "This isn't over." He hissed at my father. "You'll regret humiliating me like this." As we walked out, I realized with growing dread that we had just opened Pandora's box. The crisis we'd hoped to resolve had only deepened, and I feared what George might do next. The tension in our apartment was suffocating. Ethan paced back and forth, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. I sat on the couch, one hand resting on my growing belly, trying to calm my racing heart. "I can't do this anymore, Leah." Ethan finally said, his voice cracking, "I'm going to quit the company." My eyes widened in shock. "Ethan, no. That's your career, your future." He knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his. "You and our baby are my future. I won't let my father control us anymore." Just then his phone rang. George's name flashed on the screen. Ethan answered, putting it on speaker. "Son, I need you at the office immediately. There's a crisis with our biggest client." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I'm not coming in, Dad. In fact, I quit." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then George's voice, cold and menacing, filled the room. "You ungrateful brat, you're throwing away everything for that gold-digging whore?" I gasped, tears stinging my eyes. Ethan's face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare talk about Leah like that. We're done, Dad, for good." He hung up, tossing the phone aside, but as he turned to me, his expression of triumph turned to concern. "Leah? What's wrong?" A sharp pain ripped through my abdomen. I doubled over, panic rising in my throat. "Ethan, the baby." The next few hours were a blur of ambulance sirens, hospital corridors, and frantic doctors. As I lay on the examination table, gripping Ethan's hand, I could see the fear in his eyes mirroring my own. The doctor's words cut through the haze of pain. "Mrs. Thompson, you're experiencing severe complications. We need to perform an emergency procedure to save your baby." As they wheeled me towards the operating room, I caught a glimpse of Ethan's pale face. In that moment, I realized that our fight against his family might cost us everything we held dear. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors. I lay there, one hand resting on my still swollen belly, the other clasped tightly in Ethan's. We'd come so close to losing everything. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears welling up. "If I hadn't pushed so hard." Ethan shook his head fiercely. "No, Leah, this isn't your fault. We're in this together, remember?" A soft knock interrupted us. My mother, Veronica, peeked in, her face etched with worry. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Before I could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression morphing from concern to shock, then anger. I need to step out for a moment," she said, her voice tight. As she left, Ethan and I exchanged worried glances. Something was wrong. Minutes later, Mom burst back in, her face pale. "You won't believe what I just found out," she said, her voice shaking. "George, he's planning something terrible." My heart raced as she explained. George, furious at the humiliation he'd suffered, was plotting to ruin not just our lives, but my father's reputation as well. He was going to fabricate evidence of misconduct during Dad's teaching years, potentially destroying everything my father had worked for. "No," I gasped, struggling to sit up. "We can't let him do this." Ethan's face hardened. "I'll confront him. This has to stop." "Wait," Mom interjected. "We need to be smart about this. If we act rashly, it could make things worse." As they debated our next move, a sharp pain shot through my abdomen. I cried out, clutching my stomach. Ethan's face drained of color. "Leah, what's wrong?" The room spun as another wave of pain hit. Through the haze, I heard the frantic beeping of monitors and Ethan calling for a doctor. As darkness closed in, one thought echoed in my mind. Would our family survive this storm, or would George's revenge tear us apart forever? The community center buzzed with tension as I stood beside Ethan, my parents flanking us. George's voice boomed through the room, spinning his web of lies about my father's past. I could see Dad's face, a mask of pain and disbelief. Suddenly, Mom stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "I have evidence that proves George's accusations are false," she announced, holding up a USB drive. "And more than that, I have proof of his own misconduct and this entire plot for revenge." The room erupted in chaos. George lunged for the drive, but Ethan intercepted him. As they grappled, I felt a familiar pain ripple through my abdomen. "Not now," I thought desperately. "Stop!" I cried out, doubling over. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. In that moment, as Ethan rushed to my side and even George stood frozen, I saw the truth of our situation with startling clarity. This wasn't just about our families anymore. It was about the kind of world we wanted our child to be born into. "George," I said, my voice shaking but determined, "is this really the legacy you want to leave? Is this the grandfather you want to be?" Something in George's face crumpled. He looked from me to Ethan, then to my father. I'm sorry," he whispered, the words seeming to cost him greatly. As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. We had weathered the storm, and though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, we would face it together. Months later, as I held our newborn daughter, with Ethan by my side and both sets of grandparents cooing over her, I marveled at how love had triumphed over bitterness and fear. Our fractured ties had been mended, stronger now for having been tested. "Welcome to the family, little one," I whispered, feeling the warmth of Ethan's hand on my shoulder. "It's a bit complicated, but it's filled with more love than you could ever imagine."